it's just Martine, and today I'm letting Project Gutenberg decide my TBR. There's this feature on Project Gutenberg where you can click randomize and it will show you a random list of all the books that they have to offer. So I did this one day and I chose 5 books that I hadn't read before that were fiction, that are not like 1,000 pages long and were all in English. So I chose the top 5 that fit all of those qualifications, and I ended up with a pretty nice list that I'm going to read and review for you here today. Those books are Buffalo Bill's Ruse, The Parasite, Canoemates, Hills of Han, and Hell for Certain and Other Stories. So let's get into it. I just read my first book for this challenge. It was actually a novelette. So thanks to Project Gutenberg for picking something short for me to read. And it was The Parasite by Arthur Conan Doyle. And I ended up giving this 3.5 out of 5 stars. It's set during the Victorian period, as a lot of Arthur Conan Doyle stuff is. And it's basically about this psychological scientist who gets interested in this woman named Madame Penclosa, who is said to have abilities to put somebody under like a mesmeric trance, basically to hypnotize them so that they're suggestible and to control their actions. At first, he doesn't believe, and then he gets her to demonstrate on somebody else, and he's like, oh, I believe. But then he wants to see what the process is like from inside, from the person who is being mesmerized. So he subjects himself to this experiment where she mesmerizes him, and she kind of gets control of his mind, and it gets worse and worse and worse as the story goes. And part of this felt like reading The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde to me, because it felt like a I woke up and did things that I regret type story in that same way, and it felt about the same length too. So the pacing was slightly similar, not quite as atrocious, I would say, as the things that happen in there, but still like a similar concept. Also with the moral about science and how we need to be careful with science and experimenting on ourselves and stuff like that. There are definitely some racist elements to this, because when we're looking at the ability of like mind control in this novelette, they're talking about where that ability comes from, and typically people associate that with like the Caribbean or other specific cultures and places that have all these stories and lore around it, these ideas of witchcraft or mind control, things like that. So it's seen as like first not believable because it's from elsewhere, but then later on when it is seen as believed, it's viewed as like a very, very negative thing, and the people who practice it are seen as quite evil. So you have to know that going in and like be aware of that mindset at the time. But it was interesting because in the Victorian period, people were pretty obsessed with this idea of mesmerism. It was just like a pretty interesting concept for a story, and I had a pretty fun time reading it. It was a really quick read. It took me like 45 minutes to read. So if you ever want something short and quick and interesting, and it did give me like creepy feelings, like it's classified as a horror, and it definitely made me uneasy at several points. I'm reading it in October, so it was actually the perfect read for right now. But one of the 5 books down, and Project Gutenberg is not disappointing yet. Right, so for my second read of this challenge, I ended up reading Canoemates, which was a very eclectic choice, as all of them are. When you say, Project Gutenberg, just like randomize your books for me, and I'm gonna pick like the top 5, you're bound to get something weird. This was definitely one of them. So Canoemates is this fictional story about this trip up through like some of the reefs and Everglades in South Florida, which is interesting. I live in like Central Florida for school. I can't say I know of a ton of older literature that focuses on like this relative area, you know what I mean? So it's about this boy who gets recruited kind of accidentally because he's such a good salesman, canoeer, boat person. He's really good with boats, and he gets recruited to accompany this richer young man on this trip up through some of the reefs in South Florida, because the person who's originally supposed to go with him was like, I'll just go wait there for you to arrive, and also like it'll probably be best that you go with an expert anyway. So they go, and this book is basically all about their journeys, and a lot of stuff happens to them. I mean, they've got pretty terrible luck in general. Their canoes keep getting like stolen, they keep getting like kidnapped, I don't know. They go all over the place, and they don't make much like progress. There are some warnings I have to give, because in general, as an older book, it has some perspectives on both Native Americans and Black people that are not necessarily pretty, I would say. And those are 2 groups that the main character definitely interacts with through the course of this book, especially because during their time in the Everglades, they have a run-in with the Seminole Indian tribe, which is funny because the Seminoles are the tribe that a huge college sports team near me growing up is like based on. And I know my sister did a history fair project on the Seminole Wars in like middle school, and I don't remember like anything that she learned from that because I was focusing on my own project at the time. All of that to say, there's a lot of history about that talked about where I'm from, and so it was interesting to see it in like a fictionalized context. I'm looking up my rating of Canoemates right now. I do have to say I enjoyed the experience. I went in thinking it might be overly descriptive about the nature and stuff, and there were some descriptions of the nature and some interesting things about the nature in South Florida, which I appreciated reading about. But on the whole, it was very action-packed, maybe a little too much in some places. So I ended up giving this 3 stars, which is a pretty good rating. But that's my second book for this. Done. I just finished Hell for Sartain and Other Stories, and I gave this one 2 stars. It did something that was really annoying, in which most of these short stories were written in a like dialect heavy way. So when an author writes something so that you can tell it's in a dialect, except it was the narrator who had a dialect because it took place in like older Kentucky. It was really hard to read because they weren't words. Like, they were words, but I couldn't understand what they were. Like, it was more helpful to actually read it out loud phonetically the way it was written to figure out what he was saying than to look at the physical words. So that was really annoying. But this is a short collection of short stories, so it was only around like 50 pages long. So I just made it through in like 2 small reading sessions, and overall there were some interesting things happening, but I think the dialect distracted me so much that I would be like, I know what word this is, but then I couldn't piece all the words together into like a cohesive thought. I did like that in every story pretty much they mentioned this character named Abe Shivers, and then they'd be like, you've heard tell about Abe Shivers, and like continue, because you had heard about him in like every one of the stories. And then the purple rhododendron story was like pretty interesting, and that one was like not dialect heavy, which contributed to my enjoyment. And that one was, I think, the longest of the short stories, and it was basically about this guy who fell in love with this girl and asked her if she'd ever seen a purple rhododendron, and she said no. So in order to win her, he went out every day to the one place where he knew that purple rhododendrons like would bloom eventually, and looked at them with binoculars like every day to see if they would bloom. And they were up on this like really weird ledge that he couldn't reach. It was really dangerous to reach. And spoiler alert, I'm gonna spoiler alert for this purple rhododendron story, but I'm not sure I recommend this series of short stories to anybody, so you can skip ahead like 30 seconds if you want to not be spoiled. But basically he notices that it's blooming, so he goes up and gets the purple rhododendron, and then he falls to his death, and somebody else sends the girl the flower and says like, a man fell and died getting you this flower. Enjoy. Which was like, I don't know, so crazy to me. But anyway, yeah, so I gave that 2 stars. I know I would have enjoyed it more without all the dialect stuff, but there were some stories in there that I did take a liking to. So yeah, really random Project Gutenberg. Really random. Hills of Han, I gave it 4 stars, which is a little surprising for me because this does, there are some like war or fighting elements to this, but I paid less attention to those elements than the romantic incident in question, because it's called like Hills of Han, a romantic incident, and like I focused mainly on the characters involved in that incident, and I was enjoying my reading of it, except for the war parts. Those were, I was just glazing over those really, but I was really enjoying the characters involved. It's a usual like grumpy, standoffish main male character, and this really young female character who's an artist. She does drawing, so like the very first scene of the book, she's seen like drawing him because they're traveling somewhere together, like not together, but they're on the same like boat, I think it might be. So they're a really interesting combination, and he's also married, but like not in a loving marriage, you know what I mean? So the book is kind of like him looking for a way out and her going against the societal grain on what people think she should do. Like, people think she should not be talking to a married man and all these things, and she's just like, I know what I feel, I know what he feels, I'm gonna go with my gut, which is interesting. And her father is a missionary, which adds another interesting aspect to it, because she has recently spent several years in America, and she's coming back to China in the place where he does all his missionary work. So it's a very different setting for her. I have gotta say, there was one plot twist that made me drop my jaw. Like, it was a believable plot twist, but I did not see it coming. And it's typically a plot twist of a variety that I highly dislike, and I did not dislike this one. I thought it was incredible. I don't know. But I do have to say there are some definite like oof ouchie spots, as you're going to hear with most of these Project Gutenberg books, because they're really old books, and so oftentimes these books have very negative language used towards people of different races, ethnicities, sexualities, etc. Although I have to say that most of the ones I've read look more negatively on like Black people or gay people, and this was the first one that I've read, at least in quite some time, that mainly focused on Asian people, and it didn't say anything like really bad about them. It just used some like unsavory language to describe them, I would say. So I would be warned going into that. But overall, I enjoyed it well enough, and this is not something that I would have picked for myself, probably, but Project Gutenberg recommended it, so I read it, and I'm like, thanks, pretty good. I'm in the middle of reading the Buffalo Bill book, right? And I was just reading it right here like 10 minutes ago. And then I picked up a different book that I'm reading, and all of a sudden, I'm like 5 pages in, and it's mentioning Buffalo Bill, who I'd never like heard of the novels for before. What are the odds? I was just reading that. So I read Buffalo Bill's Ruse, and I'm going to give it a 4 stars with a major caveat. And the caveat is that this book was written a long time ago. The depiction of Native Americans, not great, because it's like a traditional Western novel, you know what I mean? It doesn't say the ugliest possible things about them, but that doesn't mean what it says is like good or perfect, you know what I mean? So just do want to throw that out there. But I'm giving it 4 stars because overall it was like a rootin' tootin' good time. I feel like it was my first time ever reading like an actual Western book, which is just kind of a fun experience because it's so like detached from life now and life in general sometimes, and you're just like, ah yes, this is purely like chaos. And also the way that this one's written, it just feels right for Western. I know it was a very popular series. This is, I think, like the 85th maybe book in the series. It's also weird because it reads, instead of as a book, it reads as like 3 novellas, because there are 3 main stories that are told, but not like together, and they don't wind together in any way. It's like this story happens and then this story and then this story, but it's not like they're labeled like this story, this story, this story. It's like they're continuous chapter headers throughout. You read and you're like, huh, I feel like that arc finished. Why is it going to continue? And then it's a totally new arc. And you're like, oh, they're just going to do something different, which is a little strange. But it's also kind of nice because, so for the first one, when I didn't know it did that, I was like, yeah, I don't know how they're going to make this last like over 200 pages. Like, I don't know how they're going to do that. So in some ways, it made it so that like you didn't get tired of each of the main threads, and it was just like a fun, quick time. It was a really fast read for me. I think it took me like 2 days to read it, and I enjoyed reading it. Like, I looked forward to picking it up, which is always a good sign. You know, I know Project Gutenberg didn't have like a reason for giving me this book, but it was a good book. I also had like really terrible misconceptions that for some reason, don't come at me for this, I thought the main character was a Mountie, but he is not. He looks like a Mountie on the front. He is Border Patrol, but on the opposite side of the country, and also in the West, it's like slightly different in these old Westerns. Anyway, so it's weird. So that presumption based off of his clothes on the cover is like incorrect, but it was a really fun time regardless, and Buffalo Bill as a character was pretty interesting. And I think out of the 3 stories, I think the one with the fake Buffalo Bill was probably my favorite. That one was wild. It was a good time. From lowest to highest, I gave Help Certain and Other Stories 2 stars. I give Canoemates 3 stars, The Parasite 3.5 stars, and then both Buffalo Bill's Ruse and Hills of Han got 4 stars. Thanks Project Gutenberg for the free books and the fun time. If you like this video, go ahead and give it a big thumbs up and comment down below. Did you know about the randomized feature on Project Gutenberg? Have you ever used it? And subscribe for more reading, writing, and college lifestyle content. And until next time, bye humans, bye!